Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in flashbang grenades, drag you out in handcuffs, and hold your wife at gunpoint while she's half naked, all because they raided the wrong house. Now here's the kicker: when you try to hold the government accountable for that mistake, the government argues that you can't sue them because their agents had discretion in how they planned and operated that raid. This exact situation went all the way to the US Supreme Court, and the court handed down a 9-0 unanimous ruling that could have big impacts for everyone in the country. And the 11th Circuit just reheard arguments in this case in light of what the Supreme Court said, and at the end of those arguments, the judges had a very specific signal about what we should be watching for this coming week. So let's break down what is now going on in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also click the like button. That just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, if you've been following the channel for a while, you know that the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the Martin family, who were essentially victims of an FBI wrong house raid. So back in 2017, FBI agents executed a pre-dawn raid against this family in the suburban Atlanta area. But instead of just going directly to the home and the address on the warrant, one of the officers used his personal GPS device. I believe he put that in his phone. Now, his GPS or his phone routed him to a completely different home where Katrina Martin lived with her boyfriend at the time and their 7-year-old son. When the FBI agents arrived at the home without warning, they smashed in the front door, detonated flashbang grenades inside the house, pulled her boyfriend out and her as well out of the closet where they were hiding with a shotgun. They handcuffed them, pointed a gun at the Martins, pulled her out half dressed, and also pulled out their child as well. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they were searching the home, and while performing that search, one of the agents actually noticed some mail on a coffee table, and he noticed that the address was different. And that's when they all kind of had this huge oh crap moment that we raided the wrong house. The officers then left the home, told the family that they would be back soon to explain, and the officers then went 3 doors down, which was actually separated by a cross street, so actually about a block over, and they executed the raid against the correct home. Now, in response to the situation, the family sued the FBI and the federal government, and they brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. The government claimed in response to this lawsuit that they had immunity under the discretionary function exception, and they asserted that this case must be thrown out. And the lower court agreed, and they dismissed this case before they even reached the merits of the arguments. This case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court stepped in, and ultimately they disagreed with the lower court. They said that this case should have moved forward, and that discretionary function exception needed to be reconsidered by the 11th Circuit because the Supreme Court was not convinced that that exception actually applied. Now, that all brings us to where we are right now, because after the Supreme Court decision, everything comes back down to the 11th Circuit and how they're going to apply that standard. And based on what happened at oral arguments, we now have a very specific clue about how the court may proceed forward and actually what they may do this week. Now, before we dig deeper into this topic, I want to talk about an awesome chance and opportunity that you guys, the viewers, have to take part in this channel. We've actually partnered with Unanimous to essentially bring you an awesome chance to make these night visions that I'm going to show you, your very own, to win these Rix RV31 NVGs. So I actually have them on my personal setup right here. They're dual tube, white Foss NVGs. They're pretty budget friendly, but they are still expensive. But, you have a chance to make these ones right here that I'm holding in my hands yours. So if you win, we're going to send you these ones that I have right here. All you have to do to make these yours is just click the link down below in the details section, also in the pinned comment. Just go to fanathem.com/scholar, buy a limited edition, collectible or digital download. And not only will you get some cool merch, but you also get a chance to make these night visions, yours, these ones right here. We will send them to you. I'm genuinely jealous of whoever wins these because, after playing with them, shooting with them, I wish I could actually keep them, but these are going to go to one of you, the lucky winners, who clicks the link down below, goes to fanathem.com, picks up, one of those items, and you're gonna be entered to get these and make these yours. So again, all you have to do is click the link down below in the details section or the pinned comment, or just simply go to fanathem.com/scholar, grab some limited edition channel merch or a digital download, and you'll be automatically entered and you'll get a chance to make these amazing sets of night vision goggles, yours. So again, if you're interested in something like that, just go and click the links down below And thank you guys so much for all of your support, and good luck to whoever wants to enter for this. Now, the Supreme Court in their ruling made something very clear. You don't automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. The government has to show that those decisions were grounded in actual policy considerations, not just mistakes. Because of this, the Supreme Court sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit to look at this, take a fresh look at this case, and potentially actually use the correct standard. And that's exactly where uncertainty now comes in, and essentially how the 11th Circuit is going to apply that standard when it comes to negligence if they reach the merits of this case. Like I mentioned, the 11th Circuit recently heard oral arguments in this case once again, and this is where things get very interesting. The judges during those arguments focused heavily on one key issue. Where is the line between policy discretion and basic operational failures? Throughout the argument, several judges pressed the government on this exact point. One of the biggest questions during the arguments was essentially how can exercising and executing a warrant at the wrong address possibly be considered a protected policy decision? The judges seemed very skeptical that something so fundamental like identifying the correct house and getting the right address on the warrant could fall under something like the discretionary function exception and give the FBI immunity. There were also questions about whether the government's theory would go too far. In other words, if this counts as discretion, then what wouldn't? Because under the DOJ's argument, almost any mistake during a law enforcement operation could be reframed as discretionary in judgment. As one of the judges put it during the oral arguments, essentially everything involves a person's choice or judgment. If the government's line of logic is followed, then everything would be covered and they would be immune from all actions. But all of those questions led directly into what may be the most important moment of the entire argument and what we're going to be watching for this coming week. At the very end of the oral arguments, the court raised a critical procedural question. The judges asked both sides whether they believed additional briefing was needed on the impact of the Supreme Court's ruling, if the FTCA does apply, if this case should not be dismissed and should move forward. The 11th Circuit essentially said, well, we'll have to reach the merits of this case, merits of the arguments, look at negligence, and that was not fully briefed in the lower court. And both parties do not want to go back down to the district court. So the 11th Circuit said that we will, rule on this on our own. If we address the FTCA question and then we reach the merits, we're going to give a merits decision. And the court essentially asked both parties if they would be open to additional briefing on the actual merits of this argument. Both sides responded in a very similar way. They said that they were not opposed to submitting additional briefs on the merits arguments, but they also both said and made very clear to the court that they believed the court here already has enough information to decide the case without those additional briefs. And the court said something very important, which is that they told the parties they would let them know this week whether they're going to request additional briefings on the merits arguments or if they're just going to disregard that and just move forward on the case on their own after the oral arguments, issue their ruling, and potentially also a merits decision. And this is the main thing that we're going to be watching for right now this week, because that decision by the court tells you exactly where this case is heading next. If the court requests additional briefing, that would likely mean that the judges are still kind of working through how the Supreme Court's ruling applies and if they will reach the merits arguments and also address the negligence issue on their own. But if the court does not request additional briefing, that could also be a strong signal that they believe this case is ready to be decided right now, that they don't need additional briefing, and maybe they don't even need that to reach the merits of this case. And that would mean a decision could be coming sooner rather than later. So the biggest takeaway from these arguments is essentially that the judges seemed very concerned about the consequences of the government's position, because if the DOJ wins here, it could effectively mean that wrong house raids are almost always immune from lawsuits. And that would dramatically expand government immunity actually far beyond what the Supreme Court actually considered, which is exactly why the court's decision in this case and maybe what they do this week, requesting additional briefing is so important. It tells us whether they are ready to draw the line right here and now or want additional input before actually reaching those merits arguments. So this case is now at a critical point. We've had a unanimous Supreme Court ruling in this case. We've now had new arguments in front of the 11th Circuit, and now we have a very specific procedural signal from the judges that they made during the oral arguments. So this week, we're going to be watching for something very simple. Will the court ask for more briefing, or are they just going to move straight forward to a decision based on the briefs that were already filed, and based on the arguments that were presented this last week. So that's what's currently happening in this critical case dealing with accountability in these types of immunities for government agencies like the FBI. Also based on what Supreme Court said in their ruling. As we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.